Ben Wirtz. I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan, right outside Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm a junior and I'm a philosophy major with a double minor in applied diplomacy and environmental studies. One of my friends happened to be um, studying applied diplomacy, and she was telling me all about it, and it sounded really interesting because I mean, as a minor in environmental studies, I really care about the relationships that humanity and society has with the environment, and I really thought that diplomacy could be a really interesting way to like, further my understanding of that and use the language that I learned in diplomacy classes for that. So switching into that really um, was helpful in allowing myself to be a little bit more creative in my thinking, being able to think through various perspectives. I mean, the Gray School being specifically being into the curriculum being the study of transprofessional diplomacy was really cool in seeing that there is no one specific definition of diplomacy. Each field kind of has its own definition, and within that, you can find kind of the common themes between each of those, which has been incredibly helpful as a philosophy major. Just not sticking to one train of thought. It's you need to look at each different one, find the common themes and the commonalities between the two, and also the differences, and figure out how, um, just like through thought processes, how you can bring those two together. I have a very um, democratic idea of what, and not democratic politically, but democratically and just like ideas, um, idea of what diplomacy is. Um, I try to not see it only as a tool to be used um, politically when thinking about politics, but also, like I said before, when thinking of our relations, a relationship with nature, our relationships individually, collectively, societally. Um, yeah, it's really just going through the diplomacy classes. It really did just allow me to create a new conception of what I saw the world to be, which I thought yeah, has really helped me in projects that I've done, in philosophy projects I've done, in environmental studies, and yeah, it provided a framework for me. It's been awesome, very cool. So I started doing diplomacy, and quickly I realized that as much as I loved diplomacy as a framework for thinking about different ideas that were being presented in my various classes, it was still kind of confined in politics. And I realized that I'm not a person who wants to stay just in that field. I mean, so many of my classmates who are just some of the most brilliant people I've ever met, that is their that is what they want to do in life. They really are like, I want to create change in the political system um, through it, in it. And I, again, as a philosophy major, think conceptually. I like to think about the structures and the formations of um, the way we see these fields, like the way we see political science, the way we see diplomacy. So being in I mean, I was a diplomacy major. I was a double major, actually. I was a philosophy and diplomacy. Um, and then I realized that diplomacy was a great foundation to the philosophy that I want to do. So they are, I mean, it's not hierarchical at all. They are entailed within each other, that there is no philosophy without diplomacy. There's no diplomacy without philosophy. And um, that connection that I was able to make has worked so well and has allowed me to find um, the area of study, the area of research that I want. And professors in philosophy, professors in diplomacy have allowed me to be able to stretch theories to their maximums so that I can create these connections within these fields. And of course, being again an environmental studies minor, I already wanted to do. My concentration in diplomacy was environmental diplomacy, so I just created two, or instead of environmental diplomacy, I was in both. I'm in both now, so I have foundations in environmental studies and I have foundations in diplomacy, and having philosophy as kind of the circle that encompasses all of those has really allowed me to dive deeper into theory of diplomacy, theory of philosophy, theory of environmental studies, and science itself. And it's really created this incredibly interesting um, synthesis of the three fields that helps me think of new ways to think of diplomacy in relation to environmental studies and diplomacy in relation to philosophy. Because, I mean, thinking of diplomacy transprofessionally, you have to think diplomacy in each field. Each field has its own version of diplomacy that fits itself, but but in that it exists in this structure of the term diplomacy, and rethinking what that means um, is very is one of my interests going forward in college. One of the most influential parts of being in the applied diplomacy program at DePaul is um, the 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 lecturers that are um, invited to DePaul to present research and even just to talk about the state of the world. And one of the most influential ones of those that I went to, and I mean, they're all incredible, but uh, we had some foremost scholar in diplomacy right now, Noi Coronado, come to one of my diplomacy classes, and we had a discussion with him. He presented some of his material. We read a chapter in one of his books on what transprofessional diplomacy is, thinking of it in a theoretical concept while also applying it to real world situations, and how we can use transprofessional diplomacy as this new um, way of conceptualizing diplomacy in the modern era. And one of the most interesting parts that I found in that chapter was a part that was briefly mentioned, but I think had profound um, impacts on this new way of thinking of diplomacy, and it's the taking diplomacy and taking the human out of it, the human perspective. I mean, we think of diplomacy as this tool that humanity has figured out through its since the rise of agriculture, or when humanity finally placed itself in one place instead of moving around. Um, is we these connections are diplomacy is I mean the study of connections between individuals, and that is a great way to think of diplomacy when thinking of it specifically in a political lens. But as a philosophy major and an environmental studies thinker, my philosophical projects is the synthesis of political and environmental philosophy. And in reading that little section from Noi Coronado, where he instead hints at the idea that diplomacy can instead be the study of diplomatic relations between organisms, not necessarily just human organisms, but organisms in their totality. So I was thinking of biological systems interacting between themselves in the symbiotic and mutualistic and parasitic relationships that viruses have with bacteria, and bacteria have with bacteria, bacteriophages, and whatnot. And studying those relationships, those fundamental diplomatic relationships, um, as a way to completely reconceptualize diplomacy as a field outside of the political. Because studying diplomacy as the political, as it's in the structure of the political is something that I'm interested in, but not necessarily something that I've written, too many papers on. It's really just thinking of the structure of diplomacy itself and thinking about diplomacy in these, I guess, situated in nature, these environmental um, relationships that animals have with animals, and animals have with humans, and animals have with their environment. Researching that and defining that as diplomacy can really, I think, can really help us evolve diplomacy as the world evolves. Because clearly, with the state of the world right now, there's some fracture that has happened in diplomacy where we have the structures in place, politically speaking, to have this new diplomacy and have it be impactful, and it's super impactful on like a small scale level. But I think when thinking of it as a structural level, there's some fundamental flaw there that needs to be researched and reconceptualized. And the way to do this, at least in my opinion, is by looking at the environment and the relationships in that, because those have been going on for so much longer than even humans have been around. So if that can be seen as a diplomatic relation, and it's been going on for so long because they've figured it out in a way that's symbiotic towards all life, then us as human species, us as the human species who maybe see themselves outside of that world, in order to get back down to it, to have that fundamental diplomatic relationship with the world, you need to study the small things before you get to the big things. But each needs to be rethought. One of the highlights of being at DePaul, and specifically being a part of the School of Diplomacy, is, again, like I mentioned before, just the people that are brought in um, to speak to us. And one of the most impactful ones, besides the conversation with Nord Cornago, was the conversation that I attended with um, Mohammed and Ilya, who were um, doing a residency at the Gray School of Diplomacy. And that conversation, which surrounded the conflicts going on in Israel, between Israel and Palestine right now, brought in so much nuance that I had never had the opportunity to experience. And it was a beautiful conversation. The emotions were so incredibly high. The stories that they told between each other were so powerful and really made you respect the information that they were giving out, and just their opinions too. And I came out after that, I think, fundamentally changed as a person, which is good. That's what these conversations should do, because it really showed me a new way to view relationships between people, fundamentally view relationships between people, and dislocate that from political structures. The people affected by this conflict, both sides, cannot be seen as evil, fundamentally evil, which is a narrative that has been progressed since the creation of Israel after World War II. Um, it is instead these political structures that have corralled these people into this false narrative and have brought out these tendencies that we all have as humans that we don't express too much because they are very negative. They are very almost animalistic. Um, and in terms of diplomacy, those reactions, being that reactionary, doesn't get you anywhere. So reformulating how diplomacy even needs to be looked at in terms of these incredibly tense conflicts that are going on in the world right now and have been going on in the world um, since humans settled down into these small communities. Seeing it instead as if there's any evil, which is such a dark word to use for this, but there's so much conflict going on that it needs to be defined by a word, and it is these evil conflicts going on that are not necessarily necessitated or even invoked by individual people. It is the system itself that has got us to this position. So diplomacy needs to be split in between looking at the relations between these people and these conflicts and understanding how they truly got into these positions. Because I mean, what was also so impactful was them explaining that the 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 help that they were receiving from the outside world, the Western world, and the headlines that were portraying this conflict were not helpful for the action that actually needs to take place in order to resolve this conflict. We think because we're a part of the West that we have this ability to put our fingers into all of these, or I guess use them as marionettes, and we're the puppet masters almost. And it is up to diplomacy to dissolve that opinion of that, because it's not the case. Each of these parts of the world exist as their own. They have their own cultural identity. They have their own historic identity, and they're modernizing and progressing just as we are modernizing and progressing, but they're progressing into different things than we are because we're fundamentally situated in different parts of the world. Thus, we have different histories and different different futures that we're going into. That doesn't mean that we are absolved of all responsibility, because that is absolutely not true. If anything, the West is what has caused this. It's actually the West has caused this, and it is up to us to take a step back, using diplomacy, using philosophy, using what we understand of our political systems to step back and truly understand our space diplomatically in this conflict. It is between these two ideologies, these two parties, these two ethnic groups, these two different people groups who are forced together, expecting to coexist. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. But it is up to diplomacy, these new conceptions of diplomacy that were stated so succinctly by Muhammad and Ilya. The dislocation of the individual from the system, where diplomacy applies to both the system and to the individual, and showing that in some cases, in order to truly provide actual diplomatic solutions to these conflicts in a way that will get them to stick takes this, it applies psychology and sociology and political science and the intersections of all three of those to diplomacy. And the necessity to do that, to see these people as individual people, to look at their histories, their individual histories, and see how they got to each of these spaces that they're in. And if that's not done, well, then there's not going to be any solution that's going to fundamentally fit this conflict, because there is no one solution to all these conflicts that are going on in the world. Each has their own individual um, each has their own individual set of problems that need solutions. In order to do that, it's really taking a step back, truly understanding what is going on, reading the literature, understanding the history, talking to these people. What was so incredible about this discussion was just the ability to have these two people come and talk. I mean, they're talking between themselves, but they were, I mean, it was a collaboration between all of us, the discussion, even if we were just sitting there. Seeing that these two people who at one point had fundamentally opposing ideologies can come together harmoniously to slow down and show that even though each of their own histories brought them in opposition together, really, if you look at it a little differently, their own individual histories brought them into a synthesis together, because they both had so much pain and violence go on in their past that made them reactionary, and made them maybe um, do actions that didn't necessarily fit who they were as a fundamental person. But in stepping back, you can realize how similar those two narratives are, and how even just one conversation can change so many people's outlook on not only this one individual conflict, but also the way in which that individual conflict can shine light on this conflict, and on this conflict, and on this conflict. Because they really, each of them give their own narrative that fits into this large puzzle that is humanity in society. And it really is constructing those puzzle pieces. And if one piece doesn't work, then you have to rethink it. You have to retool it. You have to make it. You have to make sure that it does fit, because there are these, I think there are these fundamental interconnecting structures that need to be put in place in order for humanity to truly be as diplomatic as it can be, for our interactions between each other to be as diplomatic as they can be. And we see that with these conflicts, diplomacy isn't necessarily working right here on a structural level. Of course, the conversation is its own form of diplomacy. They are citizen diplomats. They are doing so much work within their own field, and we need more of that. We truly do. We truly do, because it is, with small action, it's almost like a domino effect. Small action comes until to this bigger movement, I guess, of thought into these new futures, these new, more symbiotic, these more diplomatic futures. But yeah, that conversation really got me started on this whole new way of thinking that I think is really foundational to the understanding of what diplomacy is, was, and can be. Yeah, the big question of what I am to do after graduation. And it's challenging, because understanding, being in these fields that aren't necessarily being represented as much as they should be on a um, communally and societally, at least in the United States. Um, I mean, it's the stereotype, being a philosophy major. It's like, oh, what are you gonna do after college? And that is, something that I ask myself every day. It is something that I ask myself every day. But that's why I think being a philosophy major and having this background in diplomacy and having this background in environmental studies is so crucial to where I'm at right now, because I see a world where there aren't as many possibilities as there used to be, or maybe, there never even used to be these possibilities that we envision for ourselves. But I've never lost hope in that, in a in a future where I can be doing exactly what I want myself to be doing, which is philosophical research, I guess, into the relations between diplomacy and environmental studies and also philosophy. Whether or not that takes me to grad school after graduating from DePaul, that would be awesome. That is something that is the most likely outcome for when I graduate, is straight into grad school. I'd probably be doing some sort of, hopefully, some sort of PhD in philosophy. I think that would be incredible. But if the world takes me another direction, then that is a direction that I just kind of have to go with, because having these foundations in these three fields, it doesn't necessarily entail a future purely in academia. And I can see myself doing so many other things outside of that, while using my understandings of diplomacy, using my understandings of the foundations of environmental studies, and using my understanding of the complete history of Western philosophy, and slowly getting into non-Western philosophies as well, because when you think of philosophy and politics as a purely Western dominated project, that's where you get into these conflicts that we have right now going on in the world. And what really needs to be done is a bringing forth of those other narratives that have been suppressed by the imperial domination of the West ever since the Enlightenment, the 16th century, and even pre that. Um, I would love to work, the 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 access to these jobs is still questionable, but I'd love to work in the National Park Service. I think that would be incredible, being out in nature. My one problem with academia is you feel so separated um, with these aspects that are so fundamental to my thought. Like, I'm taking a philosophy of the environment class and I'm in a building, well, that already creates a distinction between the two, where it's like, no, this needs to be done in this environment. Um, I think working for NGOs, um, trying to advocate for these new ways of thinking, I think is so foundational, because I know for myself that I can't go into a future where I can't think like this, where I can't have this freedom of thought, because the progression from the confined space of political science to the extremely open space of diplomacy, which still kind of confined within the old political system, to then philosophy, which I mean I was raised in Western continental philosophy, so that of course creates its own sphere of influence on me. But acknowledging that and trying to pop that bubble um, is so important. And if I know that if I don't have that opportunity, then there's going to be a stagnation that I don't necessarily want. So whether my future leads me in the academic route, into teaching, into research, that would be incredible. That's exactly what I would want. But if it takes me into this more naturalistic route, where it's really advocating with these groups of people for a a new conceptualization, not only of diplomacy, but the structure of the West's way of thinking itself too, um, that future is just as good as the academic future, if even better. And if there's a way that I can synthesize the two and create some connection, well, that would just be even better. And that's probably the future where I do take, because I do think they've gone to they've they've separated themselves too much.